The day started like any other in Nolan Breck's patchwork world of grease-streaked overalls and the soft hum of machines. His workshop, half junkyard, half salvage depot, sat on the edge of Kolvek Station, a backwater trading outpost that smelled perpetually of burnt plasma and questionable decisions. The locals knew him as the guy who could fix just about anything, from malfunctioning starship engines to glitching holographic pets. Nolan wasn't a hero, a genius, or particularly brave. He was just good at patching things up, and his life's ambition mostly revolved around fixing a broken espresso machine he'd salvaged last year. But destiny, or trouble, as he'd later come to call it, had a way of walking through his door uninvited. Today, trouble arrived wearing battle-scarred armor and a look that could cut through reinforced steel. The workshop door slid open with a hiss, revealing the silhouette of a woman so tall she had to duck to enter. Her greenish skin shimmered faintly under the workshop's flickering lights, and her sharp, angular features made her look as if she'd been carved from some alien stone. Over one shoulder, she carried a weapon that Nolan instinctively knew was not standard issue anywhere. "Are you Nolan Breck?" she asked, her voice low and accented, with an edge that implied she was used to getting answers quickly. Nolan, who'd been elbow-deep in the guts of a busted grav-lift generator, froze mid-tinker. "Depends," he said, wiping his hands on a rag that might have been cleaner in another life. "If you're here about that storage bay I rented out last week, I swear I didn't know the cargo was, flammable. Mostly." The woman didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. Instead, she stepped forward and slammed the weapon onto his workbench. It hit with a resonant hum that made his fillings buzz. "I need this fixed," she said simply. Nolan glanced at the weapon. It was long and sleek, with an otherworldly design that seemed to shift subtly when he wasn't looking directly at it. Energy crackled faintly along its edges, and a series of alien runes glowed in an eerie, rhythmic pulse. It looked like the kind of thing you didn't want to touch without a hazmat suit or a will. "Lady," he said, eyeing the weapon like it might bite him. "I usually work on starship thrusters and scrap. I'm not exactly what is this thing anyway? A sword? A baton? A space machete?" "It is a Multharian blade," she replied, as if that explained everything. "And it is broken." "Well, that clears things right up," Nolan muttered under his breath. The woman's glare sharpened. "I have traveled across 3 star systems to find you, human. You will repair it." Nolan held up his hands defensively. Okay. No need to get all intergalactic warrior on me, but you might have the wrong guy. I'm more of a fix-your-toaster kind of mechanic, not a repair-your-cosmic death sword kind." Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes. Frustration, maybe? Desperation? Either way, she leaned in closer, looming over him like a storm cloud about to break. "The blade's core is destabilizing," she said. "If it is not repaired, it will collapse into a singularity and consume everything within a 10-kilometer radius." Nolan blinked. Okay, see, that would have been useful information to lead with. After a not-so-brief argument about the finer points of how not to terrify the local mechanic, Nolan reluctantly agreed to examine the blade. He slid on a pair of protective gloves that were only slightly singed from a previous misadventure and leaned in for a closer look. The weapon was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The alien runes shifted and glowed in ways that made his brain feel itchy, and the energy field surrounding it hummed like a starship engine on the verge of overloading. "So," he said, carefully poking at the weapon with a diagnostic probe, "where'd you get this thing? Space eBay?" The woman, who'd finally introduced herself as Zavara, didn't seem to appreciate his humor. "The Multharian blade is a relic of my people," she said, her tone reverent. "It is both a weapon and a symbol of power, and now it is our last hope." "Great," Nolan said, not entirely sarcastic. "No pressure, then." Zavara's glare suggested that she was debating whether or not to toss him out an airlock, but before she could respond, the diagnostic probe in Nolan's hand sparked violently, and a small burst of energy shot out, narrowly missing his face. "Whoa," he yelped, stumbling back. "Okay, noted. Don't poke the shiny murder sword with the cheap tools." Zavara raised an eyebrow. "You seem less competent than I was led to believe. And you seem way more terrifying than I was prepared for," Nolan shot back before muttering, "Guess we're both disappointed." To his surprise, the corner of her mouth twitched, almost like a smile, but not quite. Hours passed as Nolan worked, occasionally muttering to himself in a mix of frustration and awe. Zavara hovered nearby, her intense presence making it impossible for him to relax. He tried to break the tension with jokes, but they mostly fell flat. "You know," he said at one point, holding up a component that looked suspiciously like a quantum capacitor, but also maybe a tiny coffee grinder. "This thing could really use a user manual, or at least some IKEA-style instructions. You know, little stick figure diagrams?" Zavara didn't laugh, but there was a faint flicker of amusement in her eyes. "My people have no need for such things," she said. "We value skill and intuition." "Right," Nolan said, attaching the component to the blade with a hopeful click. "Because nothing says intuitive like a weapon that might implode the universe." By the time Nolan finished his initial diagnostics, he was more confused than ever. The blade's energy core was unlike any tech he'd encountered, and the alien runes seemed to react to his attempts at repair in ways that defied physics. "Okay," he said, finally stepping back from the bench. "Bad news. I have no idea how to fix this thing. Good news. I haven't accidentally blown us up. Yet." Zavara crossed her arms, her gaze heavy with disappointment. "You are supposed to be the best." "I'm the best at fixing junk," Nolan corrected. This isn't junk. This is some kind of alien voodoo tech that's way out of my league." Zavara stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Then we will find someone who can assist you." "Wait," Nolan said, frowning. "You're not leaving this thing here, are you?" "You are coming with me," she said matter-of-factly. Nolan blinked. "Oh, great. Intergalactic road trip with a terrifying alien warrior and her exploding sword. What could possibly go wrong?" Zavara didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smirk tugged at her lips as she turned to leave. And just like that, Nolan's quiet, predictable life was over. Nolan didn't know which part of this whole situation was more surreal. The fact that he was being shanghaied into some kind of intergalactic adventure, or that the towering alien warrior woman currently stuffing his backpack with tools actually thought he had a clue how to fix her weapon. "You can't just barge into my life and drag me off like this," he protested, though he made no real effort to stop her. Zavara, after all, looked like she could bench press his entire workshop without breaking a sweat. "You agreed to repair the blade," she said simply, as though that explained everything. "I agreed to look at it, not become your personal cosmic handyman," Nolan shot back, snatching a particularly fragile plasma welder out of her hands before she could accidentally crush it. "And for the record, I'm not great under pressure. The last time someone rushed me, I accidentally rewired a propulsion system to eject coffee instead of fuel. It's a long story." Zavara didn't laugh, of course. He was starting to wonder if her species even had a sense of humor. Before he could argue further, a low rumble echoed through the workshop, making his tools rattle on their shelves. Zavara tensed, her hand instinctively going to the hilt of her blade. "They've found us." "Who's found us?" Nolan asked, his voice climbing an octave. "The Voran Dominion," she said grimly. "We must leave. Now." Nolan stared at her, his mind racing. He'd heard of the Vorans. Everyone had. They were the boogeymen of interstellar space, a relentless empire that consumed entire systems in their quest for dominance. And now, apparently, they were coming for him. "Well," he said, forcing a shaky grin, "I guess this is as good a time as any to use that emergency escape plan I've been totally meaning to finish." Zavara shot him a look, and he sighed. "Fine. Let's just not die." Zavara didn't so much escort Nolan to her ship as she did haul him along like an overstuffed duffel bag. He barely had time to grab his favorite multi-tool before they were sprinting through the narrow corridors of Kolvek Station, dodging panicked bystanders and occasional explosions. "What's the plan exactly?" Nolan yelled over the chaos. "Survive," Zavara replied tersely. "Wow," he deadpanned. "Brilliant strategy. Did you come up with that on your own?" Zavara ignored him, her focus fixed on the docking bay ahead. Her ship, a sleek, midnight black vessel that looked more like a predatory bird than a spacecraft, loomed in the distance. The blade strapped to her back glowed faintly, as if resonating with her determination. But the Vorans were fast. As they reached the final stretch, a trio of Voran drones skittered into their path, their spindly metallic limbs gleaming under the station's flickering lights. The drones emitted a high-pitched whine, and their energy weapons charged with a menacing hum. Zavara didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her movements a blur of precision and power. The damaged blade still pulsed on her back, but she didn't need it. With a series of fluid strikes, she dismantled the first drone, its parts clattering to the ground in a sparking heap. Nolan, meanwhile, stood frozen at the edge of the fray, clutching his multi-tool like it might magically transform into something useful. "Do you plan to just stand there?" Zavara called, her tone edged with exasperation as she dodged a blast from the second drone. "Well, I don't exactly carry a laser cannon in my back pocket," Nolan retorted. "Give me a second to— Oh, wait!" His hands flew to the pack slung over his shoulder, rummaging through the mess of tools and half-finished gadgets. Finally, he pulled out a crude device that looked suspiciously like a modified stapler. "This is either going to work or explode," he shouted, aiming the device at the nearest drone. He pressed the trigger and a burst of energy shot out, enveloping the drone in a crackling field of static. The machine twitched violently before collapsing in a heap of fried circuits. Zavara dispatched the final drone with a swift kick that sent it crashing into a wall. She turned to Nolan, her expression unreadable. "Effective," she admitted, "though your aim needs work." Nolan shrugged, still catching his breath. "Hey, I'm a mechanic, not a marksman." Once aboard Zavara's ship, Nolan was given little time to admire its sleek, minimalist design. She shoved him into a cramped workroom that smelled faintly of ozone and alien oils, the Moltharian blade clutched tightly in her hands. "You said you need more information to repair the blade," she said, placing it on a workbench. "I will explain." Nolan leaned against the wall, his nerves still buzzing from their escape. "Great. Let's start with why the Vorans are so desperate to get their hands on it." Zavara's expression darkened. "The Moltharian blade is not merely a weapon. It is a key, a tool capable of opening dimensional rifts." "Dimensional rifts," Nolan repeated, his skepticism evident. "You mean like alternate realities?" Zavara nodded. "Or collapsing them, if used improperly. The Vorans seek to weaponize this power to destroy their enemies and expand their empire." Nolan let out a low whistle. "And you just, carry this thing around like a fancy briefcase?" "It was entrusted to me by my people," Zavara said, her voice heavy with a mix of pride and sorrow. "But I failed them. The blade was damaged in battle, and now—" She trailed off, her gaze dropping to the weapon. For the first time, she looked less like an unshakable warrior and more like someone carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Nolan hesitated, then stepped closer. "Hey," he said, his voice softer. "It's not like you broke it on purpose, and honestly, you're doing way better than I would if I were in your shoes, or boots, or whatever those are." Zavara glanced at him, her lips twitching in what might have been a hint of a smile. "Your attempts at humor are peculiar." "Peculiar's better than boring," Nolan said with a grin. "Now, let's see what I can do with this thing." As Nolan delved deeper into the blade's workings, he realized it wasn't just a piece of alien tech, it was a masterpiece of science and art, blending quantum mechanics with something he could only describe as magic. The runes etched into its surface seemed to respond to his touch, glowing brighter or dimmer, as if they were alive. He muttered to himself as he worked, a habit that seemed to both amuse and irritate Zavara. Okay, if I crosswire this capacitor, no, wait, that'll definitely explode. Let's not do that. You speak to yourself often, Zavara observed. Only when I'm trying not to think about how I might accidentally turn us into a black hole, Nolan replied, not looking up. Zavara's faint smirk returned. You are peculiar indeed. Yeah, well, peculiar is what you get, Nolan said, adjusting a component with delicate precision. Let's just hope it's enough to keep us alive. As he worked, the blade began to hum softly, its glow intensifying. Nolan didn't know if it was a good sign or a terrible one, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of whatever madness he'd been dragged into. Nolan had never been one to enjoy long flights. Maybe it was the cramped spaces, or maybe it was the fact that he always seemed to be stuck with passengers who couldn't understand the simple concept of quiet. But as Zavara's sleek ship blasted through the cold, starry void of space, Nolan couldn't help but think that this particular flight was shaping up to be one for the books. Not that he was actually paying attention to the stars. His focus was squarely on the Moltharian blade, now sitting in front of him, like an ominous glowing puzzle. Every time he made a minor adjustment, the energy surrounding it seemed to hum with a life of its own, as if it were aware of his every move. Zavara, as always, hovered nearby, keeping an eye on him without saying much. Her presence was imposing, like a walking storm cloud. But this time, Nolan couldn't help but feel a strange sort of camaraderie with her. After all, they were both in this mess together. So, he said, breaking the silence, what's the deal with these Vorons? I mean, if they're really all that bad, shouldn't you have just turned the blade over to someone else, like a galactic authority or, I don't know, the Space UN? Zavara's lips twitched, but she didn't smile. The Vorons don't listen to authorities. They destroy them. Ah, so we're hiding then? Nolan said, glancing nervously out the viewport, as though expecting a fleet of Voron warships to materialize any second. You could say that, she said. The blade is our best chance. If the Vorons get their hands on it, they will tear apart the fabric of the galaxy itself. I cannot allow that. Nolan leaned back in his seat, rubbing his face. And I can't allow my ship to explode before I finish fixing this thing, so guess we're all in this together. There was a pause. Zavara's brow furrowed, and for a moment Nolan wondered if he'd pushed too far. But then, thankfully, she spoke again, her voice softer than usual. You are different from what I expected, she said. Most humans would be more afraid. Nolan gave her a lopsided grin. Afraid? Me? I'm not afraid. I'm just cautiously pessimistic. He glanced at her again. Is it a compliment that you're not trying to kill me? I can never tell with you. She tilted her head as if considering his words, before nodding once. Perhaps. In any case, you are proving useful. I will consider that. Hey, I'm practically necessary by now, Nolan quipped. I'm like duct tape, but with more sarcasm. Zavara didn't laugh, but she seemed more at ease than when they'd first met. Progress, Nolan figured, though he didn't know how much of that was because of his stellar charm, and how much was because of the fact that they were both under the threat of imminent death from intergalactic warlords. The tension in the ship was palpable as Nolan continued to work on the Moltharian blade. He had figured out a few minor tweaks, but the core of the blade, what truly made it dangerous, remained stubbornly elusive. And as the hours passed, something about it began to unsettle him more than usual. It wasn't just the hum of energy or the occasional flare of light that seemed to pulse from its depths. It was the feeling that it was waiting. Waiting for what? Nolan didn't know. But the unease gnawed at him like a persistent itch that couldn't be scratched. He decided to take a break from the blade and explore the ship a little. Zavara had warned him that the engines weren't exactly tourist-friendly, but she'd also said he was welcome to wander as long as he didn't touch anything important. Naturally, that didn't stop Nolan from getting distracted by a massive, spherical device he found in the back of the ship. "Wow," he muttered, examining the shiny, glowing orb. "This looks like it could either be the coolest toy ever or the most dangerous thing in the universe." Zavara's voice came from behind him. "Do not touch that." Nolan froze, hand hovering over the orb. "You don't have to say it like that," he replied, his voice a mix of mock offense and genuine curiosity. "I wasn't going to break it or anything, but, what is it?" "It is a dimensional stabilizer," she said, her tone still flat. "One of the most important pieces of technology aboard this ship." "Right," Nolan said slowly. "Because if you want to survive interdimensional rifts, you need a really nice paperweight." "It's not a paperweight," she snapped, moving to stand beside him. "It is a critical part of the ship's system. Without it, we would be vulnerable to time anomalies, space-time distortions, and reality fluctuations." Nolan blinked. "Ah, I see. So basically, it's like a spatial air conditioner?" Zavara turned to him, eyes narrowing. "You have a peculiar way of understanding things, human." Nolan grinned. "You said it, not me. Look, all I know is that I'm trying not to get sucked into a black hole today. That's my only goal." Before Zavara could respond, a sharp beep cut through the air, followed by a series of flashing warning lights. The ship's artificial intelligence, whom Nolan had already nicknamed HAL, in an unoriginal but effective act of rebellion, suddenly announced in its cool, detached voice, "Warning, unidentified craft approaching. Acceleration detected." Zavara's hand immediately shot to the control panel, her eyes scanning the data with practiced precision. "They're here," she muttered under her breath. Nolan's stomach tightened. "Who? The Vorans?" "No," she said. "Worse." Before Nolan could ask what that meant, the ship's engines sputtered, the lights flickering as though the ship itself was nervous. A strange, low-frequency hum filled the air, similar to the sound the blade made, but it was far more menacing. From the viewport, a dark silhouette loomed into view. At first, it seemed like a large asteroid, but as it drew closer, Nolan realized it was a ship that looked like it was cobbled together from a dozen different kinds of wreckage. "Who the hell is that?" he asked, incredulity creeping into his voice. "Pirates," Zavara said grimly. "They don't care about the Vorans. They care about me." Nolan stared at the ship's silhouette, dread washing over him. "Pirates? Really?" Zavara's lips curled into a tight smile, though it was laced with more bitterness than humor. "If you've lived long enough to attract the attention of the Vorans, you've certainly lived long enough to be noticed by them." Nolan exhaled sharply, glancing around the cockpit for any way out. He didn't want to think about the consequences of getting boarded by space pirates. "Okay, so what do we do now?" Zavara's gaze never left the viewport. "Now? We prepare to fight," Nolan groaned. "You know, I'd really prefer to not have to do that today." Zavara shot him a look. "No one is asking your preference." The ship lurched again, this time with a force that sent Nolan stumbling across the deck. He barely managed to catch himself before slamming into the wall. But the next thing he heard was the unmistakable sound of boarding parties, gravelly voices, and the screeching of metal against metal. Zavara's eyes flared with intensity, her hand tightening on the hilt of the Moltharian blade. Nolan glanced at her, then at the door. "All right," he muttered to himself. "Looks like someone needs to be a hero." And with that, he grabbed a nearby plasma rifle. It was either that, or get sucked into the chaos that was about to unfold. "Let's make this interesting," Nolan said with a half-cocked smile. And then the door exploded open. The door blasted open with a violent force that rattled Nolan's teeth. He barely had time to dive behind a stack of crates before the first pirate came charging through, a bulky, armored figure wielding a blaster rifle. A second pirate followed close behind, his helmeted face grinning beneath a menacingly scarred chin. The air was thick with the smell of burnt ozone and raw fear. Nolan couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "Isn't it a little early for this?" Zavara was already moving, her hand snapping to the handle of the Moltharian blade. But the pirates were quick. The first pirate to step through the door raised his rifle, aiming directly at Nolan's position. "Don't move, human," the pirate growled, his voice modulated by the helmet's voice filter. "This ship belongs to the Draxian marauders now." You might want to check your calendar," Nolan said from behind the crates, poking his head up just enough to see the pirate's oversized boots. "I'm pretty sure your crew's on the wrong side of the galaxy. This ship's already taken. We're booked solid." The pirate's helmet turned slightly, like he was considering Nolan's words. Then, with a snarl, he swung his rifle up and fired. Nolan ducked just in time, the shot pinging off the nearby bulkhead with a sound that made his heart rate spike. The blast left a sizzling scorch mark on the wall, and the metal around it buckled under the force. Nolan scrambled to his feet, grabbing the nearest thing he could find, some sort of alien wrench that looked like it could take down a space station. "Well, this is a bit extreme for a check-in, don't you think?" Nolan called to Zavara, who was already slicing through the air with the Moltharian blade, its hum echoing through the room. "I don't negotiate with pirates," Zavara replied flatly, her voice as cold as the vacuum outside. She didn't need to say anything more. With a single, clean motion, the blade cleaved through the first pirate's rifle, sending sparks and shrapnel flying. The pirate barely had time to react before Zavara's foot shot out, sending him sprawling across the floor. "Whew," Nolan said, his voice oddly cheerful as he clutched the oversized wrench. "That was a close one." He ducked back behind the crates as another pirate stormed through the door, wielding a plasma grenade launcher like it was a child's toy. Nolan swallowed hard, weighing his options. If he jumped up to try and shoot, well, it would probably get him vaporized before he even reached the trigger. He did the only logical thing. He yelled, "Hey, space jabroni!" and threw the wrench as hard as he could. The pirate, caught completely off guard by the strange projectile, turned just in time to see the wrench make contact with his helmet with a sickening thud. The impact didn't knock the pirate out, but it did send him stumbling backwards, his grenade launcher fumbling in his hands. I meant to do that," Nolan muttered to himself, even though his heart was racing. Meanwhile, Zavara didn't seem at all perturbed by the increasing chaos. She was too focused on the pirates, her movements fluid and deadly. Her sword shimmered as it cut through the air, the runes on its surface glowing brighter with each swing. Another pirate charged her, but she was ready. In a swift movement, she disarmed him with a spin and then sent him crashing into a nearby wall with a single punch. The sound of his armor hitting the bulkhead was unnervingly satisfying. Nolan couldn't help but watch, his heart in his throat. "Okay, now that's impressive," he said to himself. "Why does this feel like a bad action movie? And why am I still here?" The pirate with the grenade launcher, who had somehow recovered from the unexpected wrench attack, leveled his weapon at Nolan's position again, but this time, Nolan was ready. From behind his cover, he spotted an emergency shutoff switch just next to the bulkhead. "Game time," he whispered. He didn't know what the switch did, but he didn't care. Nolan sprang up from behind the crates and slammed his hand onto the button with all the enthusiasm of someone who had just realized they might live through this after all. The ship's lights flickered. Then, all at once, the gravity field in the corridor went haywire. The pirate with the grenade launcher was sent tumbling forward, his weapon firing harmlessly into the ceiling as the anti-gravity system malfunctioned. Nolan watched in awe as the pirate hovered in midair for a second, completely disoriented. "Did you really have to break the gravity?" Zavara said, a hint of amusement in her voice as she glanced at him. She had already dispatched the remaining pirate with a precise blow to the chest, knocking him out cold. "I really didn't mean to," Nolan said, raising his hands in mock innocence. "But hey, at least it was entertaining." Zavara shot him an exasperated look before turning back to the incapacitated pirate. "These Draxian marauders are not the worst we'll face. They are an inconvenience. But you—" She gestured at him, still hovering next to the malfunctioning switch. "You should not be involved." "Me? I was just trying to help," Nolan protested, his grin widening. "I mean, sure, it wasn't exactly heroic, but, I'm not exactly a hero, am I?" She glared at him. "You are—" She paused, perhaps to find the right words. "Unpredictable." "Ah, there it is," Nolan said, raising an eyebrow. "The compliments are just rolling in today." Zavara ignored him, kneeling next to the downed pirate and searching his body for any useful tools or information. Nolan took a quick breath, letting the adrenaline fade from his system. "Next time, I'm just going to fix things," he muttered. "I mean, the whole fighting space pirates thing was fun and all, but I'd rather not make it a habit." Zavara didn't respond immediately, instead carefully removing a small device from the pirate's armor. When she turned to Nolan again, her expression was as serious as it ever was. "This was just a test. They will send more." Nolan's heart sank. "Wait, more? More pirates?" Zavara nodded. "The Marauders have a contract with the Vorans. They want the blade. If they think you are important, they will not stop. Neither will the Vorans." "Great," Nolan muttered. "Just what I needed to hear. More pirates." He threw his hands up in mock surrender. "I guess I'll have to add space pirate repellent to the list of things I need to fix." "You joke," Zavara said, "but we are not safe, not yet." Nolan gave her a playful smirk. "Yeah, but at least it's never boring." As they both turned their attention to the ship's systems and the strange device Zavara had confiscated from the Marauder, the tension in the air didn't go away. But at least, for a brief moment, Nolan could find some humor in the chaos around them. The war, the pirates, the constant danger, it was all a lot to process. But one thing was clear. Nolan was in deeper than he'd ever imagined, and somehow he couldn't help but think that things were only just starting to get interesting. The ship was oddly quiet after the pirate skirmish, as if it was taking a breather, much like Nolan, who had his feet propped up on a workbench, nursing a cup of some suspiciously strong-smelling alien drink that Zavara had given him. The taste had nearly knocked him out, but now that the adrenaline was wearing off, he was starting to appreciate the weirdness of the whole situation. "Why do I feel like I'm living in a space action movie?" Nolan muttered to himself, staring out the viewport. The stars glimmered like pinpricks in the vast, infinite dark, far too calm for the storm of chaos he'd just experienced. "You know, it would be nice if someone just told me what the hell was going on and why it always seems like we're in imminent danger." Zavara was crouched by the console, her fingers dancing across the holographic controls with precision. Despite everything that had happened, she looked remarkably calm, almost like a surgeon at work. For someone who had been through so much, it was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. "I did explain," she said without looking up. "The Draxian Marauders are nothing compared to what's coming. If the Vorans find out where we are, we will be caught between them and their allies. And you—" She paused, her gaze flicking to him briefly. "You still don't understand the full importance of the weapon you're fixing." Yeah, Nolan replied, taking another swig of his drink and grimacing. "The world-destroying superweapon, I get it. It's dangerous. Big whoop. What's the catch? I mean, we're talking about a weapon that has its own gravitational pull, right? That doesn't seem like the kind of thing you can just tinker with." Zavara's lips twitched into a brief, rare smile, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. "The blade is not merely destructive. It is ancient. From a time when the galaxy was ruled by races far older and more powerful than the ones you know. It was created for the sole purpose of controlling entire star systems." "Great," Nolan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So I'm fixing a time bomb of galactic proportions. Why didn't you just say so?" Zavara looked up, her eyes narrowing. "This is no ordinary weapon. It will choose its master. And right now, it is choosing you." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "It's choosing me? You mean it's like picking me for some intergalactic best friend award, right? Because that sounds really heartwarming." "It is not a choice in the way you think. The weapon is attuned to you. Whether you like it or not, its power will bind to you once it is fully reactivated, Zavara explained, her tone gravely serious. But if you cannot repair it in time, or if it falls into the wrong hands, yeah, we all die, and the galaxy implodes. I'm getting it now. You've really got away with words. Zavara exhaled sharply, a touch of impatience creeping into her voice. The sooner you finish, the sooner you will understand the gravity of this situation. Okay, Nolan said, trying to get a grip on the situation. I mean, sure, I'm the chosen one. Look at me. I'm basically the universe's handyman. I'll just fix this ancient, potentially galaxy-killing weapon while space pirates and mysterious alien empires try to tear me apart. No pressure. Zavara's glare would have been terrifying had Nolan not known her by now. The way she stared at him, half annoyed, half concerned, was like a constant reminder that he was in way over his head. Right, Nolan muttered. Fix the weapon. Keep the galaxy from dying. No sweat. He returned to the workbench where the Moltharian blade lay in pieces. It was a strange thing, a fusion of technology and something almost organic. Thin veins of glowing energy pulsed across the surface, as if the weapon was breathing. Nolan had worked on plenty of difficult tech in his time, everything from spaceships to malfunctioning droids, but this felt different. This felt like trying to fix a living thing. I'm going to need more tools for this, Nolan said, eyeing the glowing components that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves as he touched them. Honestly, this thing's got more wires than a tech convention. Where do you even begin? Zavara, who had been watching him work with increasing impatience, finally stood and walked over to a storage cabinet. She opened it, revealing a collection of strange gadgets and devices that Nolan couldn't even begin to comprehend. There were tools that looked like miniature black holes, and others that were far too shiny for any sane person to ever touch. Here, she said, tossing him a small handheld device that looked suspiciously like a multi-tool, but with a bizarre array of glowing buttons. Nolan caught it with one hand, flipping it over to examine it. What is this? A Swiss Army knife for space nerds. It is a frequency modulator. You will need it to stabilize the energy fields within the blade, she said, tapping a few buttons on her own wrist console. Try not to break it. Right, Nolan said, giving her a mock salute, because nothing ever goes wrong when you hand a guy like me a tool that could probably collapse a star. He returned to the blade, trying to focus on the delicate task ahead. His fingers danced over the surface of the weapon, trying to realign the internal circuitry. But each time he adjusted a component, the whole thing seemed to reject it, flickering in protest. It was like trying to fix an angry tiger with a screwdriver. Well, if you're gonna reject my work, could you at least explain what I'm doing wrong? Nolan muttered, wiping sweat off his brow. You'd think a weapon like this would come with a manual. He heard Zavara's footsteps behind him. I believe you underestimate the Moltharian blade. It is far more than a weapon. It is alive. And like all living things, it has its moods. Moods? Great. So it's a weapon with attitude, Nolan said, forcing a laugh. I can't wait to meet its inner diva. Oh, you didn't set my power settings to exactly 42.7 kilojoules. Well, now you get to deal with an energy overload. Zavara didn't laugh, but the faintest glimmer of something akin to approval, flashed in her eyes. Focus, Nolan. Right, focus, Nolan muttered, rolling up his sleeves. He reached into the guts of the blade once more, carefully connecting a series of wires, his mind racing through the troubleshooting he had learned in his years of mechanical work. Every muscle in his body was tense, his heart pounding with the urgency of the task. The blade hummed louder, its power growing as the internal systems began to stabilize. It was like tuning an instrument, a delicate, fragile thing that could shatter at any moment. Then, with a sudden flash of light, the blade's core pulsed with a steady, powerful energy. Nolan leaned back, blinking in surprise as the glow slowly faded. It's working, he whispered to himself. Zavara stepped forward, her eyes sharp. Not yet. You've only completed part of the task. Nolan blinked, staring at the blade in disbelief. You have to be kidding me. What's next? Does it need a hug? Zavara's expression softened slightly, and for a brief moment, she almost looked like she might laugh. But then the moment was gone and she was all business again. You are close, she said. But the true test will come soon. You must finish the weapon, and you must be ready. Nolan stood, wiping his hands on his pants. Yeah, no pressure, right? Zavara stared at him for a long moment before turning back to the ship's controls. The Vorans are closer than we think. Well, that's just peachy, Nolan said. I was getting a little bored with space pirates anyway. The moment of levity didn't last long. The work wasn't done yet, and the galaxy was still waiting for them to screw up. But for now at least, Nolan had one thing in his favor. He wasn't quite as screwed as he'd thought. Nolan leaned against the console, staring at the freshly reactivated Maltharian blade. He had thought it would be more dramatic. But instead, it sat there, humming softly, its energy fields pulsing with a quiet, almost peaceful rhythm. Is it supposed to look this calm? He asked, tapping the side of the blade with a finger. The soft hum was all the answer he got, and he frowned. I was expecting some grand explosion, or at least a little fanfare. You know, a light show. Something. You do not understand, Zavara said, not looking up from the map she was studying on her wrist console. The blade is alive, but it does not act on the will of just anyone. It is a tool for only the strongest, for those it deems worthy. Right, Nolan said, eyeing the blade like it was some kind of sentient pet. Because nothing says worthy like a guy who's been fixing droids and broken spaceships his whole life. Really screams chosen one energy. Zavara ignored him, her expression impassive as she moved toward the controls to engage the ship's cloaking system. She was so focused that Nolan could almost hear the hum of her thoughts buzzing in the background. So how long do you think we've got before someone else shows up to take this thing? Nolan asked, looking over his shoulder toward the nearest viewport. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of the distant shadow of another ship hanging on the edge of the system, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of stars. Zavara's eyes snapped toward him, instantly alert. What do you see? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Nolan said, tapping a few commands into his wrist console to zoom in on the image. Looks like some kind of stealth ship. Definitely not one of the Marauder's usual models. Zavara's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the Maltharian blade, her posture tightening. The Vorans. They're here. Nolan turned to face her. Well, that's just great. The last thing I need is a bunch of angry aliens with a grudge over some ancient weapon showing up on my doorstep. We must prepare, Zavara said, already moving toward the door. Do not underestimate the Vorans. They are relentless. Nolan quickly grabbed the nearest tool bag and slung it over his shoulder. Underestimate? I've got a front row seat to a galaxy-sized disaster. How could I underestimate them? Zavara shot him a sharp look, but before she could respond, the ship's alarm blared. Too late, Nolan said with a grin. I think they just figured out we're home. The sound of thudding footsteps echoed down the metal corridors as Nolan followed Zavara into the ship's control room. She was already seated at the main terminal, her fingers dancing over the touch-sensitive interface as she accessed the ship's defense systems. On the nearby screen, the stealth ship was now coming into full view, its hull reflecting the distant stars like a mirror. It's definitely Voran, Zavara said, her tone clipped. That ship carries enough firepower to cripple this vessel in seconds. Great, Nolan muttered, stepping over to the weapons console and trying to make sense of the alien symbols and flashing lights. Okay. I've got this. I just need to find the blow-up button. Zavara glanced up at him with an unamused look. If you trigger the wrong system, we'll be a burning wreck before we can even leave the atmosphere. Nolan raised his hands in mock surrender. No pressure. Got it. He paused for a moment, scanning the console in a sort of resigned amusement. You know, I've fixed a lot of things in my time, but nothing quite like this. Seriously. Who designs a weapon system that looks like a crazy alien's doodles on a napkin? Zavara's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, or perhaps the beginning of one, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. Focus. Right, Nolan muttered. Focus. He hit a series of buttons in a quick sequence, and a massive energy cannon began charging in the distance. A slow pulse of energy shot across the space between them and the Voran ship, barely missing their ship as the space around them crackled. Warning! Incoming fire! The ship's automated voice warned in an eerily calm tone. Well, that's helpful, Nolan quipped, watching as the Voran ship prepared for another strike. It's like a bad game of space whack-a-mole, but in real life. Prepare for evasive maneuvers, Zavara commanded, slamming a few buttons of her own. The ship jolted as the engines roared to life, the hull shifting into evasive positions. Nolan was thrown against the side, but he quickly regained his footing, shouting, "Is it always this chaotic?" Zavara's eyes glinted with something dangerously close to amusement. "You're getting used to it." Nolan, gripping the nearest railing for support, rolled his eyes. "You must be kidding me." A sudden jolt shook the ship, and the console flashed a warning. The Voran ship had launched a massive torpedo. Nolan felt his stomach drop as the countdown timer on the terminal started ticking. "You really had to ask about the chaos, didn't you?" he said dryly, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You know what's great? Really tight situations. So much fun." Zavara didn't even bat an eye. "Start the countermeasures. The torpedo has an energy signature. Scan it and find the weak spot." "Sure, let me just pull out my pocket-sized alien anti-missile manual," Nolan muttered, diving into the console. "How did I get myself into this?" His hands flew over the keys, ignoring the warning sirens as he focused. He wasn't sure what he was doing exactly. He wasn't a weapons expert, but somehow, in the madness of it all, he found himself diving into the intricate web of space weaponry. He was the one trying to save them now. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. "Got it," Nolan said with surprising enthusiasm as he hit a series of keys in rapid succession. A shield erupted around the ship, flashing like a neon blue bubble. The torpedo crashed against the shield in a burst of energy, ricocheting harmlessly off the defensive barrier. "Ha! Take that, you overpowered spaceship-sized bully," Nolan grinned, wiping sweat off his forehead. "I knew that button would come in handy." Zavara shot him a sharp glance, but Nolan noticed the smallest hint of approval in her eyes. "Don't get too comfortable," she said, her voice now carrying an undertone of urgency. "They'll try again. And this time, we won't be so lucky." "Yeah, I got it," Nolan said with a mock salute. "Next time I'll make sure to order extra shields. You know, just in case we decide to make a new sport out of space battles." Zavara didn't respond. Instead, she began inputting new commands into the ship's controls. Her mind was clearly elsewhere, calculating their next move. But Nolan couldn't shake the sense that, in this entire mess, they were getting just a little bit closer to the heart of whatever this was. The weapon, the Vorans, the pirates, everything was starting to connect, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The ship lurched again as the Voran ship fired another volley. Nolan grinned, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "Here we go again. Buckle up, Zavara. It's gonna be a bumpy ride." And as the ship darted into the void, the hum of the weapon growing louder behind him, Nolan couldn't help but wonder if the galaxy was really trying to take him down, or if he was just the unlikeliest hero in the universe. The battle had ended, or at least that's what Nolan hoped. The Voran warship had retreated, leaving them with the remnants of their cloaked ship, a battered hunk of space debris now drifting in the emptiness. Nolan leaned back in his seat, staring out the viewport at the swirling nebula beyond. The stars were beautiful, almost peaceful, as if the universe itself had decided to give them a brief moment of calm after the storm. "Well, that was exciting," Nolan said, rubbing his temples. His voice carried the weariness of someone who had just narrowly escaped death for the third time in a single day. Zavara, sitting across from him, was her usual stoic self, though Nolan had noticed she seemed a little less tense. Maybe the adrenaline had finally worn off, or maybe she was just trying to keep a lid on her relief. After all, they had survived the Voran ambush, the pirate attack, and the weapons malfunction. But there was still one lingering issue. The weapon. Nolan had done it. He had fixed the Moltharian blade. But, in doing so, he had changed, somehow. He wasn't the same guy who had been just another mechanic on a backwater planet, fixing old ships and droids. The blade had attuned itself to him, its energy threads woven into his body and mind, responding to his thoughts, his emotions. It wasn't just a tool, it was part of him now, and it felt like a constant hum, like a voice whispering in the back of his mind, waiting. "Zavara," Nolan said, his voice low. "What happens now?" "With the weapon, I mean?" Zavara's gaze shifted from the controls to meet his. "Now we prepare for the next phase." "The next phase?" Nolan raised an eyebrow. "We're not going back to the peaceful wandering in space idea, are we?" She offered him a thin smile. "I think it's a bit too late for that." Nolan let out a dry laugh. "You're right. I've been in over my head since the moment you showed up with that thing." He nodded toward the blade, which was now secured in its case, pulsing faintly in the corner of the room. "But seriously, what's next? We can't just keep running forever." Zavara stood, her posture straightening. "The Vorans will not give up. They want the weapon, want you to wield it. It is not only a weapon of destruction, it is a weapon of control. If they succeed in taking it, they will use it to enslave entire star systems." Nolan frowned. "And me? What happens to me? You can't seriously think I'm going to be okay with this, right? That thing it's alive. I can feel it. It's changing me." Zavara's eyes softened, and she crossed the room to where Nolan sat. "It is not just the weapon that has chosen you, Nolan. It is your heart, your spirit. The blade sees strength in you, but it also sees your hesitation. That is why you must make a choice." "A choice?" Nolan repeated, shaking his head. "I'm not exactly sure I understand what you mean." "The blade is not a thing to be wielded lightly," Zavara said, her voice steady but filled with weight. "You are its current bearer, but the energy within it is powerful, dangerous. You can either accept its influence and use it to protect the galaxy, or you can give it up. But the consequences of either choice are great." Nolan rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a familiar knot of tension building. "If I keep it, I might become a tyrant, right? But if I give it up, I risk the whole galaxy going to hell in a handbasket. No pressure, though." "There is always a choice," Zavara replied, her eyes reflecting an intensity that sent a chill down Nolan's spine. "You are not bound to it forever, but the decision is yours to make. The blade will not leave your side until you do." Nolan sat back, taking a deep breath. It had been a long journey, full of chaos, enemies, and near-death experiences, and through it all, there had been something strangely comforting about knowing that the weapon was there, almost like a reminder that he had the power to do something, anything to change the future. But now, faced with the reality of wielding that kind of power, he wasn't so sure. He glanced over at the blade, which was now glowing softly. It felt almost inviting, like a distant star waiting for him to take that final leap. And then, the choice became clear. "I've never been the hero type," Nolan said, standing up and walking toward the weapon. "But I sure as hell don't want to be the villain either." Zavara said nothing, but Nolan could sense her approval, even if she didn't voice it. Nolan took a step closer to the blade. He could feel the pull of it, its energy radiating like a pulse beneath his fingertips. It was part of him now, more than just a tool or a weapon. It was like an extension of his own will. But that wasn't the whole truth. The truth was that, for the first time in his life, Nolan realized that he was capable of more than fixing machines and getting by. He had the power to protect something greater, not just the galaxy, but the people in it. He had the power to fight for something worth saving. "Okay then," Nolan said, a small grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Let's do this." He reached out and grasped the Moltharian blade, feeling its energy surge through him. There was no turning back now. The weapon was part of him, and he was part of it. Together, they would face whatever the galaxy threw their way. Zavara stepped back, her eyes narrowing slightly as she observed him. "Then we fight, Nolan. We fight to keep the balance, and we do it your way." Nolan nodded, feeling a new sense of resolve settle over him. He wasn't the man he had been when Zavara first dragged him into this mess. He wasn't the mechanic who just wanted a quiet life. He was something more. He had chosen to fight for something greater than himself. The stars outside the viewport shifted as the ship's engines powered up, a soft hum filling the cabin. Nolan glanced at Zavara, offering her a crooked smile. "Looks like we've got ourselves a war to win." She smiled back, though it was brief. "The galaxy is vast, Nolan, and the fight is far from over." "Yeah," Nolan said, standing tall. "But we've got time, and we've got each other." As the ship glided away from the broken remnants of the Voran ship, Nolan's eyes lingered on the distant stars, the swirling nebula in the distance. There was so much more to the galaxy than he had ever imagined, and now he had a place in it. The journey had changed him, and now he was ready to face whatever came next. The war was just beginning, and Nolan was ready to fight for it all.